Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, if you're an African film student, you probably know this interesting fact. African films made during the colonial period are mostly available in the West, but virtually inaccessible to Africans. The majority of these African films were fully or partially funded by European governments and Western production companies, giving them the rights for distribution and screening. Well, in a year that sharpened the focus on Europe's imperialist legacy and priceless African artifacts stolen during the colonial era are being returned, the spotlight is turning to African colonial films, with experts from the movie industry in Africa calling for these films to be made accessible to the continent so African audiences don't miss out on historical films that hold cultural significance. Well, for more on this, let's speak now to the historian, lawyer, filmmaker and writer Ed Keazor, who joins me on the line from London. Ed, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Busy day for you, so we appreciate your making out the time to spend with us today. Are you surprised that these African films made during the colonial era are available in the West, but virtually inaccessible to Africans?
Thanks for having me, Charles. Yes, I'm not surprised. I mean, it's I think it's really logical that those who created the assets would want to keep their hands on it, and it's logical that should I say it's a consequence of the colonial, should I say, legacy of the colonial construct that we do not have access to those films. I mean, there is an anatomy behind this, and I'd be more than happy to explain that if that's what the next question is. But to answer your question directly, I am not in the least bit surprised. He who paid the piper, played the tune, and they held these assets in the West because they paid for it. But then there are other arguments around this which I'm happy to explore. I'll just wait for your next question. There's a lot to say.
Well, since you've leapt well ahead of me, why don't you go ahead and answer that question, because that's a very reasonable point you've just made. So please go ahead.
Okay. Now it's the question of African colonial film is a very broad subject, because obviously I do not wish to go into several elements of because look, there was the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the British. And otherwise, had colonial interests in Africa, and a lot of these colonial, I hate to use the word empires, colonial administrations had different policies when it came to a colonial film. But I'm going to use Britain, and indeed with minor peripheral reference to France as part of this conversation. The British, initially, the very earliest films they made were in the 19th century, people cameras. Essentially getting word back home to the custodians of the empire as to progress within the colonies. It's quite interesting that the amalgamation of Nigeria was actually filmed in 1914, but the earliest films made were in the 19th century. And in fact, it was actually quite an interesting a feature film, a very short feature film, was made. About focused on South Africa. The question of the savage, the savage South, essentially. And as you can imagine, a lot of these films were made from the colonial perspective, pursuing the colonial agenda, which was framed quite deliberately at the end of the 19th century. Chamberlain, who was the secretary for the colonies, was very, very clear about the quest for imperial profile. As he said, you cannot, to break an omelette, to make an omelette, you have to break eggs. So it was inevitable that film was part of the colonial impetus at the time, and it was meant to project empire. And progressively, it was like, okay, fine, we eventually have created our, as a conquest of Africa proceeded. Obviously using Britain as a case study, as the conquest proceeded, and the empires were settled. Or should I say the colonies were settled? Education. The education of the natives became an imperative, and film was seen as a way of pursuing this objective. The question of the savage, the savage South, essentially, and as you can imagine, a lot of these films were made from the colonial perspective, pursuing the colonial agenda, which was framed quite deliberately at the end of the 19th century. Chamberlain, who was the secretary for the colonies, was very, very clear about the quest for imperial profile. And it was meant to project empire. And progressively, as And as you can imagine, there was investment from the crown. Progressively, there was also, I mean, even the first feature length we made in Nigeria, which was filmed in Palava, filmed in 1926, the Jos Plateau, was set, even though it was supposed to be a drama and the first speaking role for Nigerian actors was meant to be a drama, was still part of the same colonial construct. So, as you can imagine, as things progressed through the century, the early 20th century, as the empire consolidated itself within the early part of the 20th century through to 1950, when the drive for independence started, a lot of films were made towards pursuing various stages or milestones of the imperial agenda. And quite copies of the films were naturally held here in the UK, while some were held in the colonies. The Nigerian Film Unit was established in 1949, which began making films in Nigeria, but still obviously under the aegis of the colonial government. So quite a few films were held in Nigeria. In fact, the Nigerian Film Corporation in Lagos was meant to be a repository of the films, some of the films made at the time. But copies were held here, and many of which actually held in repository by the British Film, the BFI, at the South Bank. Now, to access those films held by the BFI, there is a cost to pay, and I don't mean a small cost. To access films held by British Pathway, who are more or less a collecting agency, should I say, distribution agency, you license films from them, which may not necessarily belong to them, there's a price to pay. And the question you ask is, should we have access to those? Well, we have access to them as long as we're ready to pay the BFI's exorbitant premium, or we're ready to pay for British Pathway or the exorbitant license fee. And I say this, I'm a client of the British Pathway and the BFI, but it's just the fact. Now, the other part of the argument, and I will play devil's advocate now, even though my perspective is Pan-African, is that quite a lot of the films that were held by Africa, should I say Nigeria, using Nigeria as an example, and Ghana, but I'll be very, very specific about Nigeria. Quite a lot of the films that were held at the NFC, which were an inheritance from the film African the colonial film units of the 1940s and 1950s, were lost to damage because of poor handling. So there is that same. We now find ourselves within that same conversation about Africa's art, Africa's bronzes stolen in the 16th and 17th and 18th century, looted. And then the question is, should we give you back these things because will you be able to look after them? Well, the reality is that this is a bit more complicated because these films were made by the colonial by the empire for its own purposes. So really, the legal right actually rests with them. But then, is there a moral imperative? I believe there is.
Okay, well, that's the point I was going to raise, because there's a growing movement across Africa of film experts like yourself calling for these films, for Africans to have unimpeded access to these movies, because they were about Africans and they capture beyond just the copyright and all the rest of it around sort of movies made and so on. This was made at a specific period of Africa's history, which has great cultural and historical significance. And today, those films have been digitized and restored, and they're still not getting the distribution they deserve here in Africa. And that's part of the argument, that why are they almost exclusively being sort of shown in the West?
Well, that's part of a very, very long conversation that needs to be had. Because the reality is that, in fact, you say they've been digitized. Many have not been digitized. Many of the 19th century films have not been digitized. Many of the films made in the Edwardian era have not been digitized. So they're held in cryptic vaults here across in the UK and across Europe and the like. So the question, you're absolutely right. I as a filmmaker and an archivist, whenever I need to license, I need to enter into protracted conversations with repository holders like the BFI and the like. And let's be honest, the costs of access are huge. But then I find it hard. It's a bit of a hard argument, because I cannot say to them, well, you should give it to us. I promise you, don't give it to us free. But I think that really the conversation needs to be had about how Africa can access these assets. How African trusts can access these assets, at least on a basis that is not at the cutthroat commercial threshold as we find ourselves now, because these are assets that really Africa, should I say, Africa countries, former colonies of the West, should at least have a moral right of access to some of these, at least on an educational trust basis, if nothing else. Because you find, I mean, yeah, it does give a bit of work to people like me, because people instruct me to go and look for these films, and I obviously, earn an income from looking for these things. But the thing is, on a moral basis, these are trusts. These are historical trusts for Africa, which really we do not have access to, because a lot of, I mean, I'm speaking on the theory, because obviously if the guy's got a Netflix a contract to produce a film, let him pay for it. But the reality is that the educational systems, the educational access to these films is an imperative. Our educational systems need these historical assets. Because what I have found is that television, films, the colonials regarded films as an important tool, asset in delivering information. Now, is it not then a bit of an anomaly that these same assets have now been deprived, have now been wrenched away from those for whom it was meant in the first place? I think the conversation needs to be had both at a national and institutional level as to how access can be given in a manner that is agreeable. Because let us not forget that these assets are actually government assets. Many of them actually are the property of the crown.
Right.
Many of them are held on crown copyright. So the question then it actually becomes easier, because if they are purely corporate assets, then it's harder within the capitalist paradigm.
That's actually a good point you make there. But the point that people often make in the West is that even though Africans are now making lots of their own films, they still lack the distribution infrastructure and are still dependent to some extent on Europeans for distribution of many of their films. So even the classical films that were made during that time by the fathers of African cinema, Africans still don't have the rights to screen those films on the continent, even when they're trying to do so for educational purposes.
And that is exactly the point I'm making. At a certain level, this, really, people have to get off their high horse and acknowledge that there should be access to this. And that is why a conversation needs to be had at the institutional level. It needs to be had even on a diplomatic level as to how these assets can be disseminated, how access can be given to former colonies. And I do hate that phrase, but unfortunately I have to, because that is what it is. But to the countries for whom these assets were meant to be disseminated. And also, I mean, obviously not all of these were meant for dissemination within Africa. Many of them were actually created within Africa, but for dissemination in the West. At the same time, because we were the subject of these film assets, these film products, we really ought, on a moral basis, should be given access at a national level, and this conversation needs to be had. And if whilst we're talking about bronzes, let's not forget about film. It is absolutely important. Who will start the conversation? I sincerely hope that governments can start that conversation with advocacy and impetus from filmmakers, from the film lobby, so to speak. I mean, that is one of the reasons why when you gave me the invitation to attend this at short notice, I was like, look, it has to be done. Information, the push has to start, the lobbying has to start, the advocacy has to start. They have to start to think about it here in France, in Britain. They have to start to think about them, because they hold the major repositories of African colonial film. I mean, we talk about African filmmakers, but then the reality is that the very first the African filmmaking didn't really start properly. Like say, filmmaking by Africans didn't really start until the 1950s. John Amata made freedom. Usman Sembene didn't start until 1963.
Okay.
So
look, I'll tell you what.
By Europe.
Right. I'll tell you what, Ed, please stay with us. We're going to come back and continue this conversation and get to know about the other work that you're doing as well. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the historian, lawyer, filmmaker and writer Ed Keazor. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyegolu. Now, my current guest is the historian, lawyer, filmmaker, and writer Ed Keazor, who's done prodigious work on the impact of Nigeria's centuries-old past history on its present through the vast research and documentation of Mr. Keazor, a man who, it could be said, is obsessed with Nigeria's history. The world has come to know a lot more about this country, and his works have been recognized internationally through, among others, an award given to him by the African Society at Cambridge University. Beyond becoming a respected authority on Nigerian history, he is regularly consulted by global media platforms and is on the board of a number of international historical societies. And the historian, lawyer, filmmaker and writer Ed Keazor is still with me on the line from London. Ed, thanks very much indeed for staying with us. And I suppose there is a point you get to in your research where your sources become, just like what we were talking about a minute ago, mostly European and Western, because I mean Nigerian languages were largely unwritten going back into the mists of time. Do you have problems, or did you have problems finding what to work with, like going that far back? Because a lot of your research goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah, I'm just going to correct one thing. Yes, a lot of African languages are sensibly unwritten, but African scripts, written scripts have existed for several centuries, CBD being one, and several other hieroglyphics, forms of hieroglyphics script have existed in Africa. So that's often a trope that's thrown about by Western anthropologists and historians. But yes, they have it. But yes, you make a good point in the sense that as an historian, when you're looking for data, it's hard sometimes. The absence of written historical data does tend to pose a bit of a difficulty. But the reality is that even all written histories are based on orality. Yes, orality is the largest, the greater mass of the data sources of African history, without question. But then even at the end of the day, the conversation we've had now, yes, it has to be reduced into, by the time it's recorded, you put it onto a digital tape, it becomes, even by the Evidence Act in Nigeria, once with the tape upon which it is recorded, or the CD or the MP3, the USB stick, it becomes a document. It becomes a recorded document. But then it is based on an oral conversation between myself and Charles Agolo. And the reality is that yes, it's hard to manipulate what I've said, but it is not impossible. So that shows you that even written sources are not necessarily always reliable, because it's based on the subjectivity of sometimes of the writer, and even error or malice. But we're making the point, yes, it's hard sometimes, but the reality is that if we just give you a little bit about, because historiography is the study of how history is recorded over epochs, and I'm fortunate, people like myself and my generation are fortunate to have had two generations before us of African historians who have done a great deal of work in reducing a lot of the oral histories that existed into written form. Starting from people like here in Nigeria, Kenneth Dike, the likes of Kenneth Dike, Tekena Tamono, Saburi Biobaku, J.C. Anene, and the like, who have actually done a great deal of work on these are the giants upon whose shoulders midgets like myself and others of my generation do stand. And what I can say is that they have provided a platform for us to now take things to the next step. But then we do not rely simply on those. Yes, a lot of the work is done by them, but a lot of the references, the original primary references, such as original documents, original newspapers, and agreements and texts and so on and so forth, are here in the West. And that's one of the reasons why I live in London, because it's a central hub for me to work from the major repositories, the major archives of which our history is held. Around, not just in London, but also in Cambridge and Oxford, Birmingham, and so on and so forth, and Liverpool. So it gives me a springboard to use those. So I have to go to these places. But then, the truth is that I think any historian that's worth one grain of salt that sits with a head between books, is making a big mistake. I spend a lot of time in the field, recording interviews, speaking, actually going to primary sources and getting history from the sources. As they say, from the horse's mouth. It is absolutely important, because a lot of the histories we have are dying. You know,
Yeah. Well, I was gonna, I was gonna,
man dies in Africa,
right.
he dies.
I was gonna
So
take
we
you
have to
up.
pursue that.
Yeah, I was going to take you up on that point because, in a sense, I mean, your whole professional life as a historian has been dedicated to revealing and sharing knowledge, archiving and documenting and annotating and categorizing that historical knowledge in a country such as Nigeria that is still struggling with literacy and its history and its self-knowledge. Is that a big challenge, or are many people in Nigeria engaging with that history?
You see, one of the greatest blessings to Nigerian literacy, and one of the, obviously it's a double-edged sword, have been the advent of the digital age, social media, and the like. One of the reasons I began to make films, I'm not a, you know, I'm loath to call myself a filmmaker, but one of the reasons I started making films was because I found that you could, you know, for you to, because obviously the publishing industry in Nigeria died in the 90s, 80s, and 90s, you know, and it's re-emerging, you know, but the reality is that most people do not read texts. They do not read text. A lot of people read fiction, but non-fiction is something that a lot of Nigerians, a lot of Africans don't read. You know, it's just a fact. So I found that video replaced books as a source of education. And that's one of the reasons why I started making films, historical films, because I knew that if I put something on YouTube and there's a good hook to it in terms of topical information that would draw people in to be sucked into the historical content that is being offered, it was a lot more efficient. It was a lot more efficient than writing a book. The book the published work that I have that sold the most copies was the Lagos Hamburg Line, which sold about 6,000 copies. But the films I have made, the January 15 has reached several thousand, probably close to six figures around the world. You know, and that shows you the power of film. So we've had to be clever. And you know, the thing is that another thing is the power of the short film. You know, a 5-minute short historical documentary that covers the subject, but at least is a teaser that draws you in to seek for more information on all the sources that exist now. We didn't have Google. When I started my research, we didn't have Google for searching and finding out information as the present generation do. We had to go and look. We had to actually go to a library and look for the book and read it. Now it's there. So you have the opportunity to follow up on the information yourself.
That's very interesting. And I mean, we've got about a minute or so left, which is sad because this is an absolutely engaging discussion we're having. Are there things that in the course of your research you've discovered about Nigeria that have shocked or perhaps worried you and haunt you?
Well, two things, you know, that have caused me a great deal of concern is that, one, our attitude to impunity. You know, yes, and that's one thing. You know, the violence against the citizen is not something that started with NSAS or the NSAS paradigm. It's something that has been a trait that has gone through our history, even my lived memory. You know, the violence and the total lack of respect, even at ground level, for the life of the citizen. And it is something that we have to ask ourselves. That is a part of history I'm actually doing some research on. Our attitudes to violence against the citizen by the state and by citizens themselves. And the second thing that shocked me was I'd always believed, the colonial era was benign. You know, the British were benign. They were not very nice, but they weren't very bad. But I discovered there was a lot of violence impacted against the citizenry through the colonial era, through even up to all the way up to the 1950s, which gave lie to that because we were like, oh yes, the French weren't very nice or the Portuguese weren't lovely. And the British were always fair, even though it was the colonial. But there was a lot of violence. And these shocked me to my marrow because I use newspapers as a primary reference source. And with newspapers, you get, sometimes, obviously, you still have to weigh the veracity of the information, but you get real-time information. And also, oral interviews with certain actors showed me the extent to which problems we have today are a legacy of not dealing with
that's an interesting note.
Violence through our history.
Right. That's an interesting note on which to end, and a decidedly unbucolic note, if I might add. Ed, thank you very much indeed. Ed Keazor, the historian, lawyer, filmmaker, and writer, talking to me from London. That's it. Bye-bye.